Welcome to Rude Tuner's Arcade. I'm your host RT, and today we're going to be taking a look at all 9 wrestling games that came out for the NES in the US. Now, as we know, wrestling games in the beginning, they weren't really that great. I mean, with the simplified controls and simplified graphics, we can't expect the things like we got today, such as the WWE franchise that's going strong for years now, and even some of the early iterations, one of my personal favorites, the SmackDown series that ran on the PlayStation 1. And I can even go back further with N64 and their wrestling games. To me, that's when wrestling really started to take off. But to be fair, the NES did have a couple of cool wrestling games, but it was unfortunately played with a lot of stinkers. So let's start with the list. At number 9, WWF WrestleMania. Now this game came out in 1989 and was made by Acclaim, and this is number 9 on our list because this game is virtually unplayable. WrestleMania, bigger, better, and badder. It says licensed by Nintendo. Now I have to say, I know Nintendo had that clause where it said back in the day that they would quality check each game. I call bullshit. There's no way Nintendo quality checked this game. Even with licensed branding, this game is obviously the worst wrestling game ever made on the NES, and I even go further to say one of the worst games made on the NES platform. Now people could say I'm being harsh here, but I'm just calling it like it is. Now in the beginning, the game actually looks promising. You have a whole roster of WrestleMania characters that are actually name brand. The profiles actually don't look too bad, and it has like a little background of the character showing their weight, their managers, and so forth. Where it really falls apart is when you push the start button after you select a match. Now we're treated with this screen here, and then the ring drops down and you got like, they kind of look like the characters in some form, but and I'll give them credit because I'll say this is their first attempt at a wrestling game, but you don't have any moves. I mean, the moves you can do are very limited. You have a punch, a jump, a run, and a special move when you hit A and B, and basically it's like their back attack. Outside of that, I mean, you really can't do anything else. The controls are clunky, and it just doesn't function as a wrestling game. The only move you actually have in the game is a slam. You get close to the person, press a button, and I couldn't pull mine off, but you press the button and then they pick you up and launch you across the ring. That's your throw. In my opinion, this should be more like boxing or a poor man's UFC because you got punches and kicks. But outside of that, this thing does nothing in the world of wrestling. Now, one thing that does happen sometimes during the match, an icon will fly across the screen symbolizing who's wrestling. For example, if it's Macho Man, a pair of sunglasses will fly across. And also with this game, the computer is relentless. The only chance you have of beating the computer is if you punch and kick him to death. That's about it. You're not grabbing them, you're not throwing them, you're not doing any power moves because you know what? There's no power moves in the game. Now, to be fair, the music, I think they did a good job with the music. I mean, it does go with whatever character you're picking, and the tunes actually sound pretty nice. But outside of that, I'd say this game as a wrestling game is unplayable and unserviceable. This is probably the worst wrestling game I've ever played in my life. Avoid this one at all costs. Next up at number 8, we got WrestleMania Steel Cage Challenge. Now this game came out in 1992 and was made by, and I'm going to say this right now, the word I'm about to utter next is the bane of everybody's existence who played on the NES during that time, grown-ups and kids. LJN. They made this game and a host of other games that are terrible, and as you're going to see in this countdown, they've made 2 other games and each one is equally bad. I don't know if LJN had like dirt on somebody higher up in the Nintendo Corporation and just Nintendo let them make games, but man, these are some stinkers. But let's move on with this one. Now Steel Cage Challenge, we'll just call it Steel Cage Challenge. It starts off with a little more presentation and flair than the previous game. So at the bottom we got good old Mean Gene Okerlund down there, which kind of looks like Mean Gene somewhat, and he reads off the intro for whatever wrestler you pick. And I thought that was pretty cool. Now where it falls apart is once you get into the ring. So the games we can pick are, we can pick 1 player versus the computer, 2 players, and tag team. So we have 1-on-1, tag team championship, and WWF championship. So if we go with 1 player, we got a choice between a regular match and a cage match. And here's your roster you got. You got Hulkster, the Mountie, IRS, Roddy Piper, Sid Justice, Bret Hart, Randy Savage, Ted DiBiase, and Jake the Snake, and The Undertaker. So So you have a nice little cast of characters, and this was kind of more towards in the mid 90s, right before the Bret Hart era and the Yokozuna era, if we're putting a timeline on these wrestling games. Now once we set it up, we got Mean Gene, and the music's pretty spot on. It's not the best version of their intro music, but I'd say it's recognizable. You'll be able to identify the wrestler with their music. And once the game starts, I mean, the sprites look pretty good. They look like they're WWF, and I'm going to take it back old school and say WWF because that's when this game was made. It looks like the counterparts, but at the same time, they're real stiff. Controls, this thing controls probably worse than the last game we looked at. At least the first game was a little more fluid animation. This one, it looks like they're just claymation type figures. But one thing I will say with this game, you do have actual knockdown animations. You have wrestling moves, and I'm looking at the ring here, and if you ask me, the ring looks more like an election stage or something like that, like a colonial election stage. You know how they put red, white, and blue on it? And what's up with the middle part where it says WWF? I think they should have made that yellow to represent the company branding, but that's me kind of nitpicking. So next we're going to take a look at a tag team match, and then again you can pick yourself and your partner versus the computer. So I'm looking at the character sprites here, and while the character sprites, like I said, they look pretty good, Roddy Piper, he looks like he's got boobs. The characters are on outside as well. Macho Man, I believe that's supposed to be Macho Man and Hulkster. Same deal with them. So I think they could have made the sprites look a little better, you know what I mean? Maybe give him a line up there to identify his chest. But to be fair, I will say this is a step up from the WrestleMania game we just looked at. But one thing, the reason this one's so high on the list of being terrible is the fact that what makes it inexcusable for me is this game came out in 1992 at the tail end of the NES's life cycle. So this game should have been much better than what it was. And to be fair, I can see where they kind of pushed the graphics, because this game is a precursor to the Super Nintendo wrestling games that came out in the future, and those were god awful as well. And the Super Nintendo versions of this game also suffered from choppy graphics, stiff gameplay, and a limitation on moves. And to round this game out, we'll take a look at a steel cage match. And the steel cage is not about a pinfall. It's basically knocking your opponent down and then climbing out the steel cage, as you see here. Now, one thing I'll say, it varies randomly. Sometimes you'll get knocked down and it's hard to get back up. Maybe the steel cage match factors that in for the steel cage because you're not doing a pinfall with your opponent. But even so, it was just a really terrible experience. There was nothing fun about this game. For an NES game, the graphics were decent, but obviously graphics don't make the gameplay. So this one right here, I'd say definitely avoid at all costs. Next up at number 7, we have WWF WrestleMania Challenge. And this game came out in 1990. And who do you think made it? Well, who else? LJN. God. I always thought LJN stand for Losers Joining Nintendo. You can keep that if you want. So when the game starts, we're treated as this scary looking Ultimate Warrior that looks jacked, and well, we're not going to talk bad about the Warrior. Which, while he looks crazy in the face, the graphics are actually pretty good. But as we know, it's not always about graphics. So what do we got in this game? Well, you can select your game type. You can play 1 player, 1v1, and 2 versus the computer. Now, one thing I'll give this game credit for is trying something different. You actually can have your own character. And it is limited to the customizations you can put on it. It's not like today where you can make a call, create a wrestler. But with that said, it was still pretty impressive for the time. Now the cast of characters here, we have Macho Man, Ultimate Warrior, Rick Rude, Brutus Beefcake, the Hulkster, Andre the Giant, Big Boss Man, Hacksaw Jim Duggan, and yourself. So obviously I picked Rick Rude because that's my guy. Now what I'm about to show you is the only redeemable thing in this whole game, if you ask me, is the fact that you get to wrestle with Rick Rude's intro theme. It doesn't get much better than that. Everything else, unfortunately, is downhill. Now, one thing I'll say, that this game, as the games are progressing along, these LJN games, they're starting to look more like wrestling games. This one, I can actually say this is a serviceable wrestling game. And you can kind of tell it's the Boss Man, but he looks more like, I don't know, Bluto from Popeye running around, if you ever played Popeye for the NES or an arcade. In this game, you actually have a move list. And some of the moves look okay, they don't look too bad. If you look down at the bottom, I thought it was kind of weird how they had your energy displayed. It's on the side of the ring, those squares, they represent your health. and matches go pretty quick in this game. And what's really weird, at the end, when you lose a match, the winner jumps up and celebrates. Now, Boss Man's fat ass can't jump that high, I don't care what nobody says. So next up, we're gonna try a tag team match. I got Hacksaw Jim Duggan and the Hulkster, but for some reason I'm punishing myself again. So this time around, it's kind of the same story. There is a tag feature, but it's hard to figure out. There's a run button, and you do have a special move you can run and do an elbow smash. And each person does have a running move. So if mine's is Hacksaw Jim Duggan, I have the running elbow, but it doesn't fit the flow of the game because you speed across like a flying bullet. So honestly, there's really not much more to say about this game, except that it's pure dog water. That's the best example I can give, just plain dog water. This game is crap. Definitely another stinker that LJN ruined. Stay away from this one, guys, at all costs, unless you just like punishing yourself. Next up at number 6, we got WWF King of the Ring. And thank God this is the last WWF game on this list. Now, this game came out in 1993 and produced by... damn it, LJN again. Oh. Anyway, we got King of the Ring here, and this game takes place in the time frame where Bret Hart was on the rise. You had Shawn Michaels and Yokozuna during that era. So here you have, basically your options are 1 player versus a computer or 2 players. You have a one-on-one, tag team, tournament, and King of the Ring. Our cast includes Bret the Hitman Hart, Narcissist Lex Luger, Shawn Michaels, which I think he looks like a bug here, an alien bug or something. That does not look like Shawn Michaels. Mr. Perfect, Razor Ramon, the bad guy, Macho Man Randy Savage, that looks like Cyclops from X-Men with a beard, and Yokozuna. You also get the Hulkster, it looks like a drunk Willie Nelson, the Undertaker, it looks like, I don't know, it just looks like a fat cowboy, Bam Bam Bigelow, which doesn't even look like Bam Bam Bigelow, and you, where you have just long hair and a question mark for a face. One thing cool here is though, you can rename the character if you like, and you can change their attributes around, such as the speed, strength, and stamina. I thought that was pretty cool. Now once you start a game off, the sprites are actually pretty large, and they look pretty cool. It's not as choppy as the other game we looked at as far as when they had bigger sprites that were detailed. So out of all the WWF games we looked at, this is probably the best one by far, but that's not saying much. And while you really don't have an in-depth moves list, the moves you do have, they do pull off pretty well. One of the main strategies here is basically get the person down and just stomp their guts out. So I actually sat down and played this game through a whole session of the King of the Ring. And it wasn't too bad. It was a little bit of fun playing through the game, but the game is surprisingly pretty easy. Now you can pull your moves off. The game is actually responsive most of the time. The only downside is once you knock the opponent down, you can spam the stomp move. Now, one of the things that's cool about this game that makes it set it apart from the rest we looked at is it actually is a full serviceable wrestling game. You can climb in and out the ring. You actually have a set of moves. And the hit collision, believe it or not, is actually not that bad. Character sprites are huge and detailed. And in my opinion, not the worst game ever because it did come out in 1993. That was well into the NES's life cycle. So obviously not the best wrestling game on this list, it still proves to be a full serviceable game. The music's pretty good on it, and as far as animations, I've seen worse. Once you knock the opponent down, I mean, you can just basically decimate them once they're weakened by just stomping them. If you look right here, with the example of me making Razor Ramon just straight up eat boot. And while the sprites are big, if I'm looking at Mr. Perfect here, he looks like kind of like a woman, but I can forgive that because the rest of the sprites actually look pretty cool. So once you beat all your opponents, you're treated with this ending. Congratulations to the new King of the Ring. Yeah. And that crown looks terrible. It looks like broken glass on top of the crown. And then these guys got the nerve to roll credits like they made something spectacular. But to be fair, compared to the rest of the games LJN made, I guess they deserve their celebration. This game right here, I can't say it's the worst game I've ever played, but definitely not worth your time. So if you're just in the mood for something and you just want to try out something out of any of the WWF games that came out for the NES, this is probably your best bet. Next up at number 5, we have M.U.S.C.L.E. And this game came out in 1986. Now, one of the things with M.U.S.C.L.E, I know M.U.S.C.L E gets a lot of shit, right? People say this is the worst wrestling game ever. I beg to differ. M.U.S.C.L E, if you actually learn the mechanics and gameplay, it's actually a pretty fun game. And I'm going to personally explain those mechanics while we look at this game. Another thing to note is M.U.S.C.L E came off a hype of a big toy line craze. Back in the 80s, early 80s, if you were around back then, you remember these pink guys in the commercials.
Invasion of the muscle thing. They've come to drive America nuts. They're ugly, they're weird, they're tiny, they're terrible. And they're pink. There are hundreds of them.
Where M.U.S.C.L E stood for millions of unusual small creatures lurking everywhere, henceforth M.U.S.C.L E. And when the toy line came to the United States, over in Japan it's known as Kinnikuman Man. You know, the big guy with the mohawk. They spawned cartoons, and in the future for the PlayStation 2, in my opinion, they would go on to make one of the best arcade wrestling games ever made. But we're not quite there yet. We're looking at 1986. So in terms of visuals on the surface, this game looks god-awful, but graphics aren't everything. Lots of times it comes down to the play mechanics. So you have a choice of 8 characters here to choose from. I don't know all their names. All I know is Kinnikuman Man, Terrible, and a couple of other characters. But for the most part, all of them look the same, but where they differ is their special moves. So basically your attacks in this game is a flying punch off the ropes, a scoop slam from the back, basically a push off, a punch, and a jumping attack. But what's cool is, what a lot of people don't know who've never explored this game, just said it sucked off the get-go, is each character has their own special attack. So every now and again during a match, outside of the ring, this guy will appear and he'll throw in a power-up. Basically, it's a little power-up ball. Once you get it, you can perform your special moves. If you look right here, this gentleman I got with the headband, once he gets the power-up, is throwing axes. And we have to know in M.U.S.C.L E that there is no 3-count pinfall. It's more like a UFC kind of thing where you knock the person out. And believe it or not, the controls are pretty responsive. Now the movement, on the other hand, that's where we start having problems. But the game is pretty responsive. The best strategy I found for this game is to try to outmaneuver your opponent, get behind them, and scoop slam them. And you can actually abuse that. If you look up top under the round number, that represents your energy bars. Once you're down to just one circle left, your character will move slow and be very unresponsive, basically in a weakened state. At that point, you should be trying to tag your partner. So once you figure out the strategy of the game and how to deal with the computer with all their randomness, it's actually pretty fun to explore all 8 of the characters' superpowers. We'll take a look at a couple right now. So there is actually a little depth to this game, but unfortunately, a lot of people never get past the first match and write this game off. And honestly, I can't blame them. Without knowing all the mechanics of the game, well, this game is just shit. But if you do stick around and put the investment in, you'll come to find this is actually a pretty fun game, believe it or not. And another note to give these guys credit is the fact that this is pretty much a Generation 1 NES game, which released in 1986. So with understanding the mechanics, I definitely say don't write this game off like the rest of the world already has. I definitely say you should give it a go because it just might surprise you. Next up at number 4, we got Tag Team Wrestling. This game came out in 1986 and was developed by Data East. Data East, as we know, obviously a big hitter in the arcade and the NES as well. While they didn't make the best games, they actually made some pretty decent ones. In this attempt at wrestling, they actually had tag team wrestling in the arcade as well. And this game is based off that. And another thing to note going into this game is to know that the game we just looked at, M.U.S.C.L E, and this game right here were actually the first 2 NES wrestling games that came out, even before pro wrestling. So this game right here is basically all about tag teams. You only have 2 teams you can choose from, and you can only pick the second team if you play with 2 players. The teams consist of the Ricky Fighters, Ricky and Ultra Machine, and the opposite team, the Strong Bads. consisting of Macross and Whirly. Now in this game, the sprites, they're not that great, and they move real awkward. They look like they're constipated or they gotta piss all the time, like they're holding their pee. But to be fair, this was 1986. Now each wrestler has 7 different moves you can cycle through. What you do is you push the A button to grapple, and then you hit the B button, and you can see right here where you cycle through your moves. You only have 3 seconds to do that, otherwise the hold on your opponent will be broken and you have to re-grapple again. And one thing that does suck about this game is it's not a smooth transition when you're cycling through the moves. You can mash the button multiple times and still not cycle through the moves. So you kind of have to be very quick and very aware when you're picking the move you want to do. In this game, you can throw your opponent out the ring, even though it looks god awful. If you look at the ring right here, there's really no room for outside. Now I'm nitpicking here, but when you go outside, you do have a vast area to move around in. When you're outside battling, you only have a list of 3 moves you can do. And you have to be wary because there is an actual serviceable 20 count disqualification. One of the most satisfying things to me, and I know it's petty and small, but sometimes when you throw the opponent outside the ring, there'll be a chair out there. All you have to do to pick up the chair is walk over it, and you gotta make sure you beat your opponent to it. And then smack. And while it's not really that great, I think it's just a nice touch. I mean, who doesn't want to smack somebody in the head with a chair? I think that's very satisfying. As cliche as it is, and small as it is, and as bad as it looks, I think that's a nice touch. Now the strategy in this game is basically to grapple your opponent and keep doing moves on them until you wear them down. And often once you wear the opponent down, he'll go tag his partner. Now each partner has their own energy bar, and when they tag out, they actually rest and get a lot of their energy back. So the key strategy here is to drain them down and pin the opponent before he can tag out with his partner. Easier said than done. But once you play enough matches and figure out the mechanics, you'll be cruising through this game in no time. Another thing to mention with their moves are, each character has a special attack move. From what I've played, only seems to pop up when you're low on energy, or your opponent's low on energy. Now some people have said that you can only do it to your rival. I don't know if that's true, but I know the move only appears at random times when my energy is low and the computer's energy is low. Another part of the game where the computer cheats is basically the computer will turn red and start making this stamping noise. At that point, your opponent is invulnerable and you can't run from him. He's going to grab you and execute some type of move. So when you see him turn red, you can try to back off, but it's not going to help. Eventually he's going to touch you and do his move. And if you think you're going to tag and get away from him, that's not going to work either. So overall, I think this game does service as a wrestling game. And in my opinion, I think it does need the tag team mode to keep you interested. If it was a single player, I think this game would be horrible. But with the fact that it's 2-player and has the basic moves, you can battle outside the ring, and you have a move list, I feel like this is a functioning wrestling game. So by far, not the best on our list, but still a fun game to play through. Definitely give this one a try. Next up at number 3, we have WCW World Championship Wrestling. Now this one is actually a really good game. This one came out in 1989 by FCI, Pony Canyon, and Nihon Busan. And I think they did a pretty good job with the game overall. You have all the intros to all the characters, gives you a rundown of their nickname, their wrestling name, their stats, their hometown, and their specialty moves. Now the games you can pick are pretty straightforward. You have 1-player singles and tag and 2-player singles and tag. And the game comes with a pretty good cast of WCW wrestlers. You have Flair, Luger, Rotunda, Kevin Sullivan, Sting, Steiner, and which is weird, I don't know why they didn't have both of the Steiner brothers, but you do have one. You have Ricky Steamboat, both of the Warriors, Hawk and Animal, Williams, Gilbert, and Michael P.S. Hayes. Now, one of the best parts of this game is once you pick your character, you can actually pick 4 moves assigned to your controller in a typical fashion: up, down, left, and right. And I think this was really cool. I mean, obviously in modern games, we'd be able to do all these moves, but back in the day, with the limited control scheme, this was actually brilliant to give you the choice of moves that you wanted to do. And this game looks like a wrestling game. The sprites are large and very identifiable. Now, as far as the wrestling mechanics in this game does it right. So basically what you have to do is wear down your opponent and get them groggy with kicks and punches. Once you do, they'll go down on a 1-knee animation, and that's when you come up and grab your opponent and perform your move. But that's not all. Now once you do certain moves, a meter will come at the bottom and you hold the button. The further the meter is in the red, the more powerful your attack will be. So it gives you a line of death even when you do your moves. The more damage your opponent has taken over the match will depend how much further the meter goes in the red. So if your opponent is heavily injured, sometimes the meter will just stay in the red so you can execute your move. The sound effects on this game are really good, and so is the music. And it's a nice touch when you're doing a submission move, and I like how they have the cutaway scenes when you climb the top rope or when you throw an opponent outside the ring. The movement of the game is actually pretty fluent, and the controls are very responsive. Even though we're only showcasing one WCW game in this list, for what they had, I think the moves look outstanding. So for what it's worth, I feel like this game knocked it out of the park as far as wrestling games. Very fun experience, moves are fluent. I like the mechanics where you can actually put the person down and then include that mini game that you have to play with the meter when you're performing your moves. Overall, excellent job on this one, but we still got 2 more games to go. Next up at the number 2 spot, we have Pro Wrestling. Now this game right here obviously is the most iconic out of the whole list of games we've done so far, and for a lot of reasons. This game right here came out in 1986 and was developed by Nintendo, and the characters in this game are iconic. Everybody knows the cast of characters, all their signature moves, and the iconic music. And this game right here is rich with history. In 1988, Computer Gaming World and Famitsu reported Pro Wrestling being the #1 game in the United States for a whole 2 months. And then further, in 2001, Game Informer called this the 79th best game ever made in the world. That's a pretty big accomplishment. So here's the comparison of the characters on the NES Pro Wrestling and their real life counterparts. We have King Slayer, based off Ric Flair, Ken Corn Karn, based off Killer Khan, Starman, based off Mascaras, Fighter Hayabusa, based off Antonio Inoki, Giant Panther, based off Kerry Von Erich, Great Puma, based off of Tiger Mask. And as far as the Amazon goes, I'm not really sure. One thought for me would be the Missing Link from back in the day, the early 80s. But others have said Creature from the Black Lagoon. I guess that's up for debate. Let me know in the comments if you can find his match, because I'm not 100% sure. Now, what makes Pro Wrestling stand out from the other games is its list of moves. Each character has universal moves, but even then, they still might be different, such as most characters have a rolling sobot, but Ken Corn Karn has a judo kick. And his punch is different, he has a Mongolian chop. Now, certain moves like a body slam is universal among each character. Each character can climb the top rope, can throw the opponent outside, and all have the brain buster. If you ask me personally, I think any character that has a pile driver is probably more powerful than a character who does not, but that's just my opinion, because the pile driver does so much damage. You can throw your opponents into the ropes, there are counters for that move, you can duck under a lariat shot, you can catch yourselves on the rope to stop yourself if you've been thrown. And when you're playing against a computer, another part of the gameplay mechanics is that each character has a text that is unique to them. And we'll go through them real quick. Fighter Hayabusa has the back brain kick, which is kind of hard to do, but I will say it can be glitchy. Like right here, every now and then I can get it to where I can perform a pile driver as you see here on King Slender and execute a back brain kick in the same sense, ultimately doing a combo. Of course, there's broken glitched mechanics throughout the game, but it is possible. Moving along, you have Starman, and he's probably one of the most iconic characters in the game next to King Slender. He has his flying cross chop and his somersault kick, which as a kid was a fan favorite. It just looked cool to do. Next up, we got Ken Corn Karn, and really not nothing special about him, just his kick and Mongolian chop, and often he's called the weakest character in the cast. I don't believe that, because if you look right here, in the beginning, you can abuse this kick. It's simple to do, it's always a guaranteed hit, and all it takes is 2 kicks to get them weakened enough to take a brain buster. Now, one thing to know about the brain buster and the pile driver is, those are your power moves. If your opponent is not weak enough and you attempt a pile driver, you'll just make this face trying to grab the opponent, but nothing will happen. However, if you try a brain buster, the opponent will reverse it. So make sure the opponent's kind of worn down before you try those 2 moves. Moving on, we got Giant Panther. Now Giant Panther, if you ask me, I think he might be the weakest of the cast when you pick him. Now when the computer picks him, different story, but as a human, when you pick him, I find that the Iron Claw takes away his backdrop, and that's a huge wear down move you can use early on in the game. Also, he has no pile driver, it's been replaced with a headbutt. Now while these moves look cool, they really don't do a whole lot of damage, so those are two powerful moves missing from his repertoire. Next up, we got the Amazon, and he is just a fun character to play all around. Now, it is true, he is similar to Giant Panther, with the Outlaw Choke replacing one of his moves, and the Piranha Bite replacing the other. So he has no backdrop or pile driver. However, I feel like his moves are a little stronger with the Piranha Bite and the Outlaw Choke, and for some reason for me, they seem to come out easier and I'm actually more successful when I attempt that move. But again, that's my opinion. And lastly, we got the gentleman, the Slender Bender, King Slender. Now this is probably the most broken character in the game as far as the ones you can pick. And what makes him the best to me is the fact that he has a pile driver, a suplex, backdrop, kicks and normal kicks and punches, and this backbreaker. And this backbreaker, this move does a lot of damage for the low effort you have to put in to perform it. All you gotta do is grapple with your opponent and press the A button. And you can do it at any time, at the beginning of the match or the end of the match, and it takes a good amount of damage. So basically what will be a basic body slam to most, this move right here can replace that. And it comes out pretty easily, it doesn't take a whole lot to get this move going. So that's the list of the characters that you can control. So when you play a game, you start off at the beginning to get the belt. Once you get the belt, you have to defend the belt 10 times. Now if you pick King Slender, you have to play a couple of extra matches, as Giant Panther will be the champion. Now once you successfully defended the belt 10 times, you'll take on the Great Puma. He's the last character in the game that appears once you've made 10 consecutive and successful title defenses. Now normally during a title defense, when you lose the belt, you have to go back a couple of matches to get your belt back. However, you do have 2 consecutive bouts you can do with the Great Puma, which I thought was very nice because it's kind of hard to get up to him. So Nintendo was pretty cool with rewarding you with 2 consecutive matches. So you can lose one match and then a second match and then you're done. So in essence, you have 2 chances to defeat him. What makes him so hard is he has a combination of all the wrestlers' moves. He has a Piranha Bite, he has Starman's Somersault Kick, and a host of others. Plus, his damage is insane and he has all types of stamina. So if you actually beat him in a straight up fight without doing the ring out trick, it can be very, very challenging. All his moves have major priority, and basically, in my opinion, either you're gonna have to have really fast hands or a turbo controller, which was common back in the NES days. Turbo controller, it was kind of a big deal. Now if you don't have a turbo controller, all hope's not lost. You can actually do what I'm doing here and just defeat him outside the ring, which is basically knocking him down and getting back in the ring before he can recover and he's counted out and disqualified. Once you do that, you'll be treated to a final cutscene where you're holding the belt. And that's pretty much the end of the game. Now I can't tell you the hours and hours upon hours that me and my uncle played pro wrestling. Me and my buddies played a ton of pro wrestling, and this game has lived on in gamers' hearts as the wrestling game to have for your Nintendo Entertainment System. From the graphics, to the music, to the gameplay, this game was the total package. However, there is still one game, in my opinion, that did an even better job than pro wrestling. Might not be as popular, but it still is a great game in its own. And in the #1 spot, we're obviously talking about Tecmo World Wrestling. Now this game came out in 1990 and was published by Tecmo. And it brought everything that a wrestling game should. With great graphics, great gameplay, a ton of moves to do, and actual cutscenes in the game. Now the cast for this game was Akira Dragon, El Tigre, Pat Gordon, Rex Beat, Jackie Lee, Boris Chekhov, which I think is Stan Hansen, Mark Rose, Julio Falcon, Randy Gomez, and Dr. Gildo. Now Dr. Gildo, I always thought he looked like that guy off He-Man, you know, Zodak, one of the Comet Watchers back in the day. That's just a personal thing I thought I'd throw in here. So basically, in my opinion, this is the best wrestling game you can play on the NES, and for a ton of reasons. Number one, just the graphics of this game. Whenever Tecmo made something back in the day, graphics and storyline and gameplay was their main priority. And with sports games, they did very well with Tecmo Bowl and Tecmo NBA basketball. So why wouldn't they do great with wrestling? The only difference here is they don't have name brand wrestlers, but that's totally okay because the mechanics and gameplay are so good. So when you start off and you pick your character, you're going to be offered to the athletic gym. And you can actually train and level up your character. Now the only time you can come back to this gym is if you lose a fight. Now while you don't have to play the game with a turbo controller, I'd highly recommend at this part use the turbo controller at least while you're doing your training. Now if you want to use it during the game play afterwards, that's totally up to you. But for here, you don't want to miss out on this energy. So now if you have lightning fast fingers, maybe, but just look at the energy you can get if I use a turbo controller while I'm doing my training. So you can get up to 3 power balls maxed out. And I feel like it's necessary for this game because the opponents can be tough. Once they get on their roll of keep getting all their moves in, they're going to take more damage, dish out more damage than you, and it's going to be hard to get grappling moves on them. But I will help you out with some strategies during this gameplay. Now you'll notice at the beginning, one thing that's cool is there's an announcer at the bottom of the ring. The people in the stands look pretty detailed as well for being just background. And the ring looks really nice. The outside of the ring, it looks nice as well with the tile decorations on it. And you actually have an announcer that gives you commentary step by step what's going on in the match. At the time, this was actually groundbreaking because you didn't have that. You had an announcer at the beginning, but you got a guy at the bottom giving you updates in real time and actually calling out the moves as the match goes along. So with this game, you can fight inside the ring, outside the ring, and there is an actual 20 count. And also each wrestler does have signature moves, and some of the signature moves are shared among wrestlers, but it's still enough to give each wrestler their own individual feel and playstyle. Now the grapple system's pretty good. Once you lock up with an opponent, you can push A in a direction for your heavier moves and B in a direction for your lighter moves. You can attack the opponent when he's on the ground, which I highly recommend doing to knock off some of that damage. Also, certain gifted characters like the character I have, Dr. Gildo, he can perform his giant swing at any time in the game by coming to the bottom of the feet, pressing sideways and B. So in this game, all characters aren't created equal, but each one does have a fighting chance. There are submission moves in the game, but you're not going to tap out, you'll just fall down and be depleted energy. Now one thing I will say about this game, as you dish out damage, you do replenish a little bit of your own health. The only way to win a match here is by out of ring disqualification or 3 count fall. If you're playing against a computer, they can beat you as well by the time clock expiring. As far as the sound effects and music in this game, well, the music knocks it out the park. While it's a very nice tune, it does fit in line with wrestling. And as you progress, the further you get to the end of the game, the music does change every couple of matches you win. So ultimately you'll have 3 different tracks you use, and plus the final boss will have his own theme music. More on that later. So one thing to note with this game that is another standout feature is, and it's a small detail, but I appreciate the small things like that. You know how normally when you're playing pro wrestling, if you got the opponent next to the rope and you try a backdrop, your move won't come out. But in this game, if you're in a part of the ring when you're grappling, for example a suplex, and you can't do the move because of the ring post, you will actually take time and they will show animations of the wrestlers rotating, and then when you have open lanes, you can perform your move. Another cool thing with this game that stands out and is mostly noted for are the cutscenes when you perform some of your powerful moves. To do this, generally one of the characters have to be severely weakened, or you could be severely weakened as well, and then you perform your special move. Then you'll go into a cutscene animation similar to Ninja Gaiden, and it'll show you doing the move with a beautiful cutscene and a signature flash at the end once the move has been performed, and then revert back to the standard layout of the game, which I think puts a high accent mark on the power of the move and gets you that much further invested into the game. So after you make it through all the characters, you are treated at the end with an ending. So basically, you'll celebrate by throwing your fist up and they're declaring you the winner. However,
my fellow Decepticons, as your new leader, I What's my coronation?
You're interrupted in your ceremony by somebody named the Earl of Doom, the Blue King. And basically, he's like Giant Panther 2.0. A palette swap of the character wearing a mask, but he's all gray. And again, he possesses all the moves of all the characters. He's a very tough customer. All his moves have high priority and high damage. And unlike pro wrestling, you don't get 2 shots to beat this guy. You lose here, you lose the belt, and you're back in the ranks of trying to get to the championship match again. So you got 1 shot to beat this guy, otherwise you're gonna have to keep playing the game till you get back up to him. So you got 1 shot, make it count. Best strategies I can give you for this guy is don't heavily engage with him because his moves are gonna come through 99% of the time. Best thing to do is wear him down with punches, kicks, and body slams. Take every advantage when he's on the ground to get a cheap shot in, and just avoid him at all costs until you have about half his life whittled down. Then and only then should you engage him in a full-size grapple and go for your more damaging moves. But even then, that's not 100% guarantee, because once the computer gets on a roll with their grapples, they do high damage and have high priority. But keep at it and eventually you'll get them. So overall, I'd say this is definitely my number 1. Some people might say pro wrestling due to its level of popularity, but as far as gameplay mechanics, graphics, and the fun this game puts out and the realism, I feel like Tecmo knocks it out the park definitely and takes our number 1 spot. But let me know in the comments if you disagree. So after looking at all the wrestling games, I definitely have to say WWF, or WWE now, but back then WWF, probably made the worst games as far as wrestling goes ever on the NES. Now they did improve in later years as we know today, but I thought it would be cool to look at their humble beginnings and the curse of LJN ruining a lot of our childhood with these crappy ass wrestling games. Thank God for other games like Pro Wrestling and Tecmo World Wrestling. But that's gonna do it for this one, guys. I thought it'd be a fun trip to go down memory lane and take a look at our childhood and the wrestling games we played. Please rate, comment, and subscribe, so that way you don't miss any more gaming news or gaming reviews on this channel. And with that, guys, take care of yourself, protect your inner peace, God bless you, and we'll catch you on the next one. Thanks for watching.